Welcome back to the Chaim Davies Show, and today we're continuing our Pesach exploration series, working our way through the text of the Haggadah to discover the process of slavery to freedom. And today we're taking a look at what the Rambam considers to be the heart of the storytelling obligation on Seder night, which is the text of Arami Oved Avi, which amazingly is able to unify the two narratives of freedom that we're supposed to speak about on Seder night, namely the process of slavery to liberty and idolatry to truth. And of course, there's a ton going on in these short 4 verses and the way that the Haggadah records all of the different midrashic interpretations, which is essentially what's going to go on over here. As the Rambam put it, we're being doresh Arami Oved Avi. We're expounding on the text through the lens of midrashic analysis, right? Looking for what's called surface irregularities, right? Abnormalities in the text, details within the language of the text, which indicate to us deeper meaning. And each one of these interpretations, you could spend a tremendous amount of time on. Now, as I'm looking at this, I'm noticing that, we're just a few days before Pesach, and there's a ton more of Haggadah to go. So what we're going to be doing actually for the Arami Oved Avi is we're actually going to take a look at this in more broad strokes. We'll take a look at each of these 4 verses of the Arami Oved Avi and understand what is this verse trying to convey, and how are each of the interpretations, which fall almost into the subset of that verse, part of the description that pasuk is trying to come across with. Okay, so we'll take it one verse at a time, and you're more than welcome to unpack each of these ideas. There's a tremendous amount going on within each one of these drashot of Chazal, but just to get an overview and understand, at least have a sense of the subject matter that is worth diving into on Seder night, I thought that would be the most efficient and valuable ways to do this. So the first verse begins with Arami Oved Avi, which is interpreted 2 different ways within the commentaries, and that's how this story works in a multi-layered fashion. Arami Oved Avi could be a reference to Lavan, that Lavan, the Aramean, sought to destroy my father, sought to destroy Yaakov, as we spoke about in the previous episode, by assimilating the nation's potential, the children, into a foreign milieu, and not allowing the Jewish people to continue onwards. But the verse could also be understood, as it is by many of the commentaries, as meaning, my father was a lost Aramean, Arami Oved Avi. And this is a reference to Avraham Avinu, namely that our ancestries from Avraham beforehand were a group of lost nomads of Arameans, just like everybody else. And it was from that point, either from Lavan or from a state of idolatry, that God brought us out from there and brought us into the process of Mitzrayim. Vayered Mitzrayima, and we descended to Egypt from there. Vayagar Sham b'Betei Ma'at, and we lived there, we dwelled there temporarily with very few numbers. Vayhisham legoy gadol atzum v'rav, and it was there that we became a nation, great, mighty, and numerous, or mature, as we'll see. And so the Haggadah continues to say that there are 6 components within this verse that speak to us about how the Jewish people develop within the exile environment. The first is that we recognize that we're living there compelled by divine decree. It's only by recognizing that we're here on a divine mission, we're here because we have a purpose, we haven't been abandoned, that we're able to really tap into what an exile is meant to provide us. The second component is that we were few in number. We start with a small mass, but rather than focusing on quantity in order to survive, it's actually based on the quality of the Jewish presence and the strength of identity that we're able to maintain, even in small numbers, which is what allows us to truly thrive within an exile environment. The third aspect, Vayihi Sham Legoy, is that the Jewish people began to shine when they were living in exile. They were mitsuyanim, and that is that the Jewish people rise to the top when we're in exile. Rather than staying away from society, shunning participation within the peoples surrounding us, we constantly, throughout our history, you just look back and you see it, have constantly risen to the highest echelons of society, and in doing so, create a situation in which the transition out of exile is smooth and efficient. The next component is gadol atzum, that the Jewish people in exile begin to flourish, but not only that, to thrive and to become an exceedingly populous people, to inundate our societies with the presence of the Jewish people around them, and ultimately to influence through our presence, through our power within society to an extent that we become a force that needs to be reckoned with. And that's what essentially happened in Egypt. It reached the point where Pharaoh is concerned what's going to be with the Jewish people. And finally, the last ingredient is v'rav, that normally this is translated to mean numerous, as in we became a large population. But the way the Haggadah explains it is from the word rav, as in mature. And it evokes this in these verses from Ezekiel, from Yechezkel, which describes the maturation process of a young girl, and that as she became mature and became ready to participate in an intimate relationship, to become someone's lover, that was the way that God related to the Jewish people, that we reached the point of maturation, not only in size as a nation, but within our hearts, within our souls, that we were ready to really throw ourselves back into the relationship with a full heart and soul. And so these are the stages of the development process of the Jewish people within Galut. And that's the first verse of Arami Oved Avi. The next verse here describes the oppression process that the Egyptians put us through, or that any exile tries to place upon us. And this is Vayareu atanu hamitzrim vaya'anunu vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha. And so the Egyptians were very evil to us. They were wicked to us. They afflicted us, and they placed upon us hard labor. Now, these three components, as the Haggadah goes on to explore in more detail, are the first stage being a paranoid oppression of the Jewish people. That Paro essentially freaks out, and he doesn't know what to do with the nation, and ends up oppressing them out of a paranoid fear that maybe they'll become so powerful and so independent that they'll team up with the enemies and end up running out of the country. The second component is useless labor, applying ridiculous amounts of work that essentially is meaningless, like the way that our interpretations of our tradition explain the cities of Pithom and Ramses, which were these sinking cities, that nothing was coming out of any of that labor, fruitless labor, what's called avodat perach. And the final stage was bringing us to the breaking point, applying avodah kasha that was so difficult and so exhausting that our people were literally passing out in the fields of exhaustion, just waking up in the morning, being dragged back to work without even the time or the interest in walking back to their homes. And so these three components, the paranoid oppression, followed by the useless labor, and ultimately pushing us to the breaking point through backbreaking labor, were these stages of the development of the struggle within exile that sets the stage for the Jewish people to cry out, which is exactly what happens in the third verse of the Arami Oved Avi. And so we read, "Vanitzak el Adonai Elohei avotenu." We cried out to God. "Vayishma Adonai et kolenu." God heard our voice. "Vayar et onyenu v'et amalenu v'lachatzenu." He saw our afflictions and the difficulties that we were going through, the pressures, and that's what he was about to respond to. And so the Haggadah identifies 5 elements within this verse, which are descriptive of our response to Galut, our response to being in exile. The first is our recognition of the fact that we are being enslaved, realizing that we've shifted. We're no longer our own people. And what's going on around us is not just hard work, it's not just anti-Semitism, it's straight up avdut. And the pasuk says, "Vayanchu bnei Yisrael min avodah." The Jewish people groaned from the avodah, and they cried out to God about the avodah. The second aspect of it was that God heard our cries, and he contextualized those cries within the narrative of the Galut Geula, of the exile-redemption process. He plugged in that pain as being not just the pain of an individual, but being a national crisis, that which is included within the covenantal process that had been set into motion with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The third through fifth elements deal with what God saw about what we were dealing with in Egypt. The first being, he saw the complete erosion of family life, which is of the essence to the Jewish experience. The second of those components was the destruction of our continuity, the fact that the Egyptians were throwing the babies into the river. And finally, the pressure, the breaking aspect of not being able to have your own mind to yourself, where there's so much external influence, so much outside push that you literally aren't able to think for yourself anymore. This is what God saw, that beyond the erosion of the family, beyond the destruction of the people in the future, the very existence of the people as they are was at risk. And so we arrive at the fourth and final verse of Arami Oved Avi, "Vayotzienu Adonai mimitzrayim biyat Khazakah ubezroa netuya ubemora gadol uveotot uvemoftim." That God took us out from Mitzrayim with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, with great wonders and with signs and with miracles. And so here the Haggadah identifies 6 elements of the redemption process, right? Each one of these metaphors that are being used to describe how God took us out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm are telling us something different. So the first element of this verse is that it is God himself who is involved within the redemption process. This isn't some like second or third tier project that God has some angels, some agencies, some messengers of his to take care of on his own. If he's going to take the Jewish people out, if he's committing himself to the nation, then he's there and he's going to take care of everything single-handedly. The second element is the Biyat Khazakah, the mighty hand, which the Haggadah tells us is a reference to the dever, to the pestilence. There are a couple different interpretations as to why this is being stressed above all the other 10 plagues. One approach is that according to the Medrash Rabbah and Shmot, every single plague was accompanied by dever. And so, whereas you might have been able to, or the Egyptians might have been able to excuse away certain plagues as being natural phenomena, the presence of dever within each and every one of the plagues indicated that isn't just some freak event in the river that it's turning to blood, but the presence of dever showed that this is consistently a supernatural event taking place. Other interpretations tell us that the uniqueness of dever was that it's described as being done single-handedly by God. And so the Haggadah is stressing the dever plague, the pestilence, to show us that that's where God's presence was most manifest. The third component here is the Zroa Netuya, an outstretched arm. And the Haggadah tells us this is a reference to a sword, as if it was dangling over the Egyptian's head. And it quotes a verse from Divrei Hayamim, from Chronicles, which describes the feeling in Jerusalem before the destruction of the temple, as if there was a sword dangling over them. And so the Egyptians felt this intense, oppressive feeling of impending doom that was coming upon them. The next component is the Bemora Gadol, with incredible awe. And this was the Gilui Shechina, the revelation of God's loving presence. That not only was there a feeling on behalf of the Egyptians that God was going to be destroying them, but the Jews began feeling an ever-growing sensation that God's love is becoming more manifest and more experiential within their midst. The next thing is the Be'otot, which is the signs. And this is a reference to the Mateh, to the staff of Moshe, the tool, the vehicle through which all of the miracles were going to happen within the land of Egypt. And this was obviously indicative of the fact that humanity, mankind, represented by Moshe himself, were going to be wielding supernatural powers as we moved our way out of the exile. And it obviously showed that God was in support of what the Jewish people were going to be doing. And the final element of the redemption process here is the moftim, the wonders. And the Haggadah tells us this is a reference to the blood. Now, some interpretations say this is a reference to plague number 1, which seems to be a little bit, out of order. Many of the commentaries explain that this is a reference to the blood of the Korban Pesach, which the Jews had to paint on the doorway of their homes on the night of Makat Bechorot, on the plague of the firstborns. And the idea here would be essentially the slaughter of the deities of our exile, where if you kind of imagine for a second, remember that the sheep was considered to be a deity in Egypt, and it took an incredible amount of conviction and courage on behalf of the Jewish people to take the deity of their oppressors, slaughter them en masse, and paint it on the doorways of their homes as if to say, this is where we draw the line between your culture and our identity and what's going on inside of our home. And the reestablishment of the home as being a private residence, a place where the influence could be entirely from within the nation of Israel themselves, was almost the final culmination of the redemption process. Now, the Haggadah records one more interpretation for this final verse here, and that is the 10 plagues. And this is where all the kids get all excited because we're finally going to get to talk about the makot that happened in Egypt for a quick one sentence. And we're going to just quickly mention that each one of the phrases in this verse is a reference to another 2 makot, and so that all equals together 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 10. And these are the 10 makot that God threw down upon the Mitzrim in Egypt. And those, of course, are Dam, Tzvardea, Kinim, Arav, Dever, Shchin, Barad, Arbe, Choshech, Makat, Bechorot. And if that was too long of a list for you, well, Rabbi Yehuda came up with a very convenient mnemonic for you to be able to remember each of these 10 plagues in a much more concise fashion, known as Datzach, Adash, Be'achav, which is an acronym for each of the 10 plagues. Now, obviously, there are all sorts of interpretations as to what Rabbi Yehuda is trying to accomplish by creating this mnemonic. Is it too difficult for us to remember all of the 10 plagues? I think that goes beyond our purview for today's episode, especially considering that we're already definitely over time. And I'll just close with encouraging you that, of course, there's so much going on within this Arami Oved Avi. As we've seen, it's the essence of the storytelling responsibility on Seder night. I would encourage you to take a look at commentaries, find out more, get a great Haggadah that has some more information about this, and make sure that you're doing justice to all of the details of what's going on within this presentation. Until next time, I'm Chaim Davies, and this is the Chaim Davies Show.